I had walked the path of the seer for 3,000 years. I had seen the birth of stars and the death of worlds. I had watched my people fade into myth, one soul at a time, consumed by the hunger that we ourselves had birthed. I had learned to read the skein of fate as others read water or wind, tracing the infinite threads of possibility through the warp's turbulent depths. I had seen every horror this galaxy could conjure. I had witnessed the moment when hope became a lie we told ourselves to survive one more day. But I had never seen this. The infinity circuit sang around me, a chorus of the dead that had become my only companions in these final years. Our craft world drifted through the void near the eastern fringe, far from the light of terror, far from the wars that consumed lesser species. We were ghosts, sliding through the darkness, trying only to endure. The wraithbone walls pulsed with the souls of ancestors, their voices a constant whisper in my mind, a reminder that death was not an ending for our kind, but a different kind of prison. I stood before the chamber of spirits, my hands pressed against the smooth surface of the circuit, feeling the pulse of 10 million souls flowing through me. This was my meditation, my prayer, my purpose, to commune with the dead, to seek guidance in their accumulated wisdom, to find some path forward through the narrowing corridors of our survival. Then they screamed, all of them, at once. 10 million voices, shrieking in perfect unison, a sound that was not heard but felt, a psychic wave that tore through my mind like a blade of ice. I staggered backward, my hands flying to my head, trying to shield myself from the onslaught. But there was no shielding from this. The dead were screaming, and their terror was absolute. I fell to my knees, the wraithbone floor cold against my skin. Blood ran from my eyes, hot and thick, staining my robes. I could taste copper. I could hear nothing but the screaming. And then, through the chaos, through the terror, I felt it. A light. Not in the material realm, but in the warp itself. A light that should not exist. That could not exist. I forced my eyes open, forced myself to look, though every instinct screamed at me to turn away. The warp stretched before me, visible through my heightened senses, a roiling sea of emotion and madness, colors that had no names, shapes that defied comprehension. This was the realm where demons danced and gods feasted. This was the mirror of mortal suffering, the reflection of every fear and desire that had ever darkened a sentient heart. And there, burning through it like a star falling through fog, was the light. It was golden, pure, impossibly, unbearably pure. It did not flicker with the madness of chaos. It did not pulse with the corrupt radiance of the dark gods. It was not the cold, necrotechnic glow of the ancient machines that slumbered beneath dead worlds. It was not the Astronomicon, that dying lighthouse that guided humanity through the storm. It was something else, something that did not belong in this broken universe. The light moved through the warp like a blade through flesh, and where it passed, the immaterium recoiled. Demons fled from it. The tides of chaos parted around it. It was not destroying the warp. It was simply existing within it, and its very existence was an insult to everything that the warp had become. I watched, transfixed, as it drew closer to real space, closer to the material galaxy. I could feel it pulling against the fabric of reality, could sense the strain as two incompatible truths tried to occupy the same space. This thing, this light, it was not born of the warp. It was not born of this galaxy. It was foreign, alien in a way that transcended species or origin. It was an impossibility made manifest. The screaming of the dead began to fade, replaced by something worse. Silence. The infinity circuit went quiet, every soul within it frozen in a moment of absolute incomprehension. They did not understand what they were witnessing. Neither did I. I tried to speak, tried to form words, but my throat had closed around the terror that gripped me. This was not the terror of death. I had long since made peace with my mortality, with the certainty that one day my soul would join the circuit or be devoured by she who thirsts. This was something deeper. This was the terror of the unknown, of witnessing something that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence. The light touched real space. I felt it like a shock wave, a ripple that spread across the galaxy, invisible to most but undeniable to those who could see. Somewhere, on some world I could not name, it had arrived. It had entered our universe, and the universe, I realized with dawning horror, was not ready for it. I collapsed fully then, my body giving out, my mind unable to process what I had witnessed. The blood from my eyes pooled beneath me, staining the wraithbone, seeping into the cracks. My lips moved, forming a single word, the only word that could possibly describe what I had just seen. Impossible. But even as I whispered it, I knew the truth. It was not impossible. It had happened. The light was here, and nothing in this galaxy of endless war and suffering would ever be the same. The word hung in the air like smoke, like ash, like the last breath of a dying star. Impossible. But the galaxy had long ago stopped caring what was possible and what was not. This was the 41st millennium, and there was only war. The Imperium of Man sprawled across 1,000,000 worlds, a rotting corpse that refused to die, held together by faith and fear and the iron will of bureaucrats who had never seen the stars. Humanity had spread like a plague across the galaxy, claiming dominion over planets they could not name, ruling populations they could not count. They built hive cities that scraped the clouds, monuments to their own desperation, where billions lived and died without ever seeing sunlight. They prayed to an emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years, a corpse enthroned in gold, kept alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day. The Astronomicon flickered in the warp, that great psychic lighthouse that allowed humanity to navigate the immaterium, and with each passing century it grew dimmer. Ships were lost in the warp with increasing frequency, swallowed by storms that had no names, torn apart by entities that should not exist. The Imperium bled from 1,000 wounds, each one mortal, each one ignored because to acknowledge weakness was to invite extinction. In the eye of terror, the Chaos Gods laughed and schemed and feasted. Khorne sat upon his throne of skulls, counting the dead, drinking deep of humanity's rage. Nurgle spread his blessings across plague fleets and death worlds, his gifts of entropy welcomed by those too broken to remember what health felt like. Tzeentch wove his plots within plots, watching the Imperium tear itself apart through ambition and paranoia. Slaanesh hungered for excess, for sensation, for the exquisite agony of souls pushed beyond all limits. They were gods born of mortal sin, reflections of everything that sentient life had ever felt and feared, and they were winning. From beyond the galactic rim, the Tyranids came, hive fleets that blotted out stars, a hunger that could never be sated, a consciousness so vast and so utterly alien that to glimpse it was to go mad. They consumed worlds, stripped them of all biological matter, left behind nothing but barren rock. They learned with each battle, adapted with each defeat, and they were numberless as the stars themselves. Beneath dead worlds, the Necrons stirred, ancient machines in the shape of beings that had once been flesh, now awakened after 60 million years of sleep. They rose from their tomb worlds with weapons that could unmake reality, with technology that mocked the crude instruments of younger species. They remembered when they had been masters of the galaxy, and they intended to reclaim what had been stolen from them by time and treachery. The Eldar, the ones who had not fallen, drifted through the void on their craft worlds, dying slowly, carefully, trying to preserve what remained of their souls. They had birthed a god through their excess, had torn open the galaxy and created the Eye of Terror through their own depravity. Now they lived in the shadow of that crime, every soul precious, every death a tragedy, because death meant feeding the god they had created. She who thirsts waited for them, patient and hungry, knowing that eventually every Eldar soul would be hers. The Orcs fought because fighting was what Orcs did. They spread across the galaxy like spores, crude and brutal and terrifyingly effective. They knew only war, and in a galaxy drowning in war, they thrived. The Tau spoke of the greater good, of unity and progress, ignorant of the fact that their empire was a candle flame in an ocean of darkness. They did not yet understand that hope was a luxury this galaxy could no longer afford, and through it all, the warp screamed. The immaterium churned with the accumulated suffering of 10,000 years, a realm where physics meant nothing, and nightmare was the only constant. Demons pressed against the barriers of reality, seeking entry, seeking flesh to wear and souls to devour. The barriers grew thinner with each passing year. The veil between worlds was tearing. This was the galaxy into which the light had fallen. This was the universe that did not believe in salvation, because salvation implied that something was worth saving. Across 1,000 worlds, psychers collapsed. Astropaths screamed into their Vox units, their messages garbled and desperate. Sanctioned psychers aboard naval vessels tore at their own faces, trying to claw out the vision that had been burned into their minds. A navigator on the edge of the Ultima Segmentum opened her third eye and saw the light, and the sight drove her into catatonia from which she would never wake. The Inquisition received reports from dozens of sectors simultaneously. A new warp anomaly, a psychic event of unknown origin and unprecedented magnitude. Threat level unknown, response protocol unknown. The reports were filed, analyzed, and marked for immediate investigation. The Imperium did not tolerate unknowns. Unknowns were heresy, until proven otherwise. In the warp, the Chaos Gods paused in their eternal war. They felt the light, tasted it, studied it with senses that transcended mortal understanding. It was not of the warp. It was not of real space. It was other, foreign, wrong. They reached for it with tendrils of influence, trying to corrupt it, to claim it, to understand it. Their touch slid away like water from oil. The light rejected them, not through force, but through simple incompatibility. They could not touch it because it existed on a frequency they could not reach. For the first time in millennia, the dark gods knew something that resembled uncertainty. On Terra, in the Imperial Palace, the Emperor stirred upon the golden throne. The custodians felt it, a ripple of awareness that passed through the throne room like wind through a crypt. The Emperor's psychic presence, usually focused entirely on maintaining the Astronomicon, flickered for just a moment toward something else, toward the light. And in that moment, those who served closest to the throne swore they felt something they had not felt in 10,000 years. Not hope. The Emperor was beyond hope. But recognition, as if he had seen this before, as if he knew what it meant. And in the silence that followed, the galaxy continued its slow spiral into oblivion, unaware that something impossible had just been born within its borders. The recognition faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the weight of 10,000 years and the endless screaming of the Astronomicon. The Emperor returned his attention to the dying light, to the beacon that kept humanity from drowning in the warp's madness. The custodians resumed their vigil. The moment passed into memory, filed away among countless other mysteries that would never be solved. But the light did not fade with the Emperor's attention. It continued to move. It continued to fall. The world was called Tertius Harvester 9, a designation that held more weight than its actual name, which had been forgotten centuries ago when the Administratum had reclassified the sector. It was an agri-world, unremarkable in every way, except for its capacity to produce grain. Endless fields stretched beneath a pale sun, tended by serfs who had known nothing but labor since the day they were born. They worked the soil with tools that would have been ancient on any other world, because the Mechanicus had deemed this planet unworthy of modern equipment. The harvest was collected, tithed, and shipped to feed guard regiments on distant war fronts. The people who grew the food rarely tasted it themselves. Overseer Malthan stood at the edge of the northern fields, reviewing production quotas on a data slate that flickered and sparked from centuries of poor maintenance. He was a thin man, made thinner by the weight of responsibility that came with ensuring this world met its tithe. Failure meant execution. Failure meant the world would be declared in breach of imperial law. He did not allow himself to think about failure. The sky was the color of old parchment, streaked with clouds that never seemed to move. The workers in the fields below were bent double, their backs curved from years of stooping, their hands calloused and bleeding from handling stalks of grain that were sharp enough to cut flesh. Children worked alongside adults, because on an agri-world, everyone who could walk could work. There was no childhood here. There was only labor and eventually death. Malthan was about to return to the Administratum station when the sky changed. It did not darken. It did not split with lightning or fire. It simply opened, as if reality had decided to show what lay behind its surface. And through that opening, something descended. At first, Malthan thought it was a meteor, but meteors burned. Meteors screamed as they tore through the atmosphere. This was silent, gentle. It fell like a feather, like snow, like something that had no weight at all. The light surrounded it, that same golden radiance that had rippled through the warp, and as it descended, the workers in the fields stopped their labor and looked up. They should have been afraid. They should have run, but they simply watched, their faces turned toward the sky, their tools forgotten in their hands. The figure touched down in the center of the northern field, and the grain around it bent away as if pushed by an invisible wind. The light faded, and what remained was a man. He stood impossibly tall, taller than any human Malthan had ever seen, taller even than the Space Marines depicted in the propaganda hollows that played in the chapel on Saints' days. He wore no armor, no robes, nothing that identified him as warrior or priest or official. He was simply there, present in a way that made everything else seem less real by comparison. His skin seemed to hold light beneath its surface. His eyes were blue, but not the blue of any sky Malthan had ever seen. They were the blue of eternity, of distances that could not be measured. The stranger did not speak. He simply stood there, looking at the workers, at the fields, at the pale sun overhead. And on his face was an expression that Malthan had not seen in 30 years of service to the Imperium. Compassion, not pity, not contempt, not the cold calculation of a master looking at tools, but genuine compassion, as if the sight of these broken, exhausted people caused him pain. The workers began to move toward him, slowly at first, then faster. They dropped their tools. They left their stations. They approached the stranger with something that looked like hope, though Malthan was certain they had forgotten what hope felt like. A child reached him first. A boy, no more than 7 years old, his body covered in the lesions that came from malnutrition and the diseases that spread through the worker barracks like wildfire. The boy's eyes were crusted with infection. His arms were thin as sticks. He looked up at the stranger and said nothing, because he had learned long ago that speaking without permission earned a beating. The stranger knelt. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid of frightening the child. He was so tall that even kneeling, he was nearly at eye level with the boy. He reached out with one hand, large enough to crush the child's skull without effort, and placed it gently on the boy's forehead. The light returned just for a moment, soft, warm. It flowed from the stranger's hand into the child, and Malthan watched, his data slate forgotten as the lesions began to close. The infection drained from the boy's eyes. Color returned to his cheeks. The boy gasped, not in pain but in surprise, and then he did something that Malthan had never heard in all his years on Tertius Harvester 9. He laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, unfiltered and unafraid. The boy laughed and touched his own face, feeling the smooth skin where infection had been, and he laughed again. The other workers surged forward. They came in dozens, then hundreds, reaching toward the stranger with hands that trembled from hope and fear in equal measure, and the stranger did not pull away. He touched each one. He healed each one. Sickness vanished. Wounds closed. Broken bones straightened. The crippled walked. The blind saw. Malthan stood frozen, his mind trying to process what he was witnessing. This was impossible. This was heresy. This was a miracle. But miracles came from the Emperor alone, and the Emperor had not performed miracles in 10,000 years. His hand moved automatically to the Voxcaster at his belt. His training took over, the decades of protocol and procedure that had been beaten into him since his induction into the Administratum. He activated the emergency channel, the one reserved for planetary emergencies, for invasions and uprisings and Xenos incursions. His voice was steady, though his hand shook. This is Overseer Malthan, Tertius Harvester 9. Unknown Xenos or demon manifesting miracles in Northern Field Sector 7. Population affected, requesting immediate clarification of threat level and orders. Awaiting response. He closed the channel and looked back at the stranger, who was still kneeling among the workers, still healing them one by one, still wearing that expression of infinite compassion. And Malthan realized, with a cold dread that settled into his bones, that he had no idea whether he had just called for salvation or signed the death warrant for every soul on this world. The response came 3 days later, delivered not through astropathic channels, but in person, aboard a gunship that descended from orbit with the kind of speed that suggested urgency and the kind of precision that suggested violence. Inquisitor Vorsalis of the Ordo Hereticus stepped onto the soil of Tertius Harvester 9 with her bolt pistol already drawn. She was a woman who had spent 40 years rooting out heresy in all its forms, who had burned entire hive sectors when corruption took root, who had ordered exterminatus on worlds where the taint ran too deep to purge. She wore the rosette of her office openly, a declaration that she answered to no authority save the Emperor himself. Behind her came a retinue of stormtroopers, their hellguns charged and ready, and a priest of the ecclesiarchy, whose face was hidden behind a skull-faced rebreather, his armor inscribed with prayers against the unclean. They came expecting to find a world in the grip of demonic possession. They came prepared to kill everything that moved, to scour the planet with fire if necessary, to add another footnote to the Imperium's endless list of necessary atrocities. What they found was worse. The fields were thriving. Not the usual desperate harvest that barely met the tithe, but genuine abundance. The grain stood tall and golden, swaying in a breeze that seemed gentler than it had any right to be on an agri-world. The irrigation systems, which had been failing for decades, now ran clear and strong. The storage silos, usually filled with grain that was half rotten before it was even shipped, held crops that looked healthy and whole. The workers were not bent in labor. They were standing upright, their backs straight, their faces turned toward the sun. Children ran between the grain stalks, actually running, not the desperate scramble of those fleeing punishment, but the genuine play of youth. Malthin stood at the edge of the field, his data slate hanging forgotten at his side, watching the Inquisitor approach with something that looked like relief and terror mixed together. "Where is it?" Vorsalis demanded, her voice cutting through the gentle rustling of the grain. "Where is the Xenos, the daemon? Where is the source of the corruption?" Malthin pointed with a shaking hand toward the center of the field, where the workers had gathered in a loose circle. The stranger stood among them, still tall, still radiating that impossible presence, his hands resting gently on the shoulders of an elderly woman who was weeping with joy. Vorsalis approached with her stormtroopers flanking her, weapons raised, the priest muttering prayers of warding under his breath. She had expected to feel the taint of chaos, the familiar nausea that came with demonic presence, the way reality seemed to bend and twist around corruption. But there was nothing, just the stranger, and the people, and the fields. "Step away from the civilians," Vorsalis ordered, her bolt pistol aimed at the stranger's head. "Identify yourself, state your purpose, declare your allegiance." The stranger turned to face her, and his movement was so smooth, so effortless, that it seemed unnatural. Not the unnatural of the warp, but something else, something that did not belong. He looked at the Inquisitor with those eternal blue eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire field. "I am a stranger here," he said simply. "I came because I heard suffering. I stayed because I could help." "That is not an answer," Vorsalis said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "What are you? What species? What world? What god do you serve?" The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I serve no god," he said. "I serve life." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The priest behind Vorsalis inhaled sharply, his prayers stumbling. The stormtroopers glanced at each other, uncertain. Malthin made a small sound of distress. To serve no god was to serve nothing. To serve life was to serve the self, to place individual existence above the glory of the Imperium, above the will of the Emperor. It was the most fundamental form of heresy, the sin from which all other sins flowed. "Heretic," Vorsalis said, and the word was final, absolute, a condemnation that carried the weight of 10,000 years of doctrine. "By the authority vested in me by the God Emperor of mankind, I declare you anathema. Your existence is a blasphemy. Your words are corruption. You will be executed immediately, and all those you have touched will be purged for their own protection." She raised her bolt pistol, aiming between the stranger's eyes. The stormtroopers adjusted their aim, ready to fire on her command. The priest raised his crozius, preparing to deliver the final blessing over a heretic's corpse. The stranger did not move. He did not raise his hands in defense. He did not plead or argue or try to flee. He simply looked at Vorsalis with an expression of profound sadness, the kind of sadness that came from watching something beautiful destroy itself. "You have forgotten what you were meant to protect," he said softly. Vorsalis's finger began to squeeze the trigger. The bolt round would take his head clean off. It would be quick, merciful even, by the standards of the Inquisition. Then the Psyker collapsed. He was a sanctioned Psyker, one of the few who had survived the soul binding and retained enough function to be useful. He had been standing at the edge of the retinue, his witch sight focused on the stranger, trying to pierce through whatever veil concealed the creature's true nature. Now he fell to his knees, his hands clawing at his face, his mouth open in a scream that started silent and then built into a wail of pure incomprehension. "He is not of the warp!" the Psyker shrieked, his voice breaking with each word. "He is not of the warp. He is not demon. He is not human. He is not Xenos. He is not anything. He should not exist. He should not be here. He is not of the warp." The Psyker's eyes rolled back in his head, blood streaming from his nose, and he began to convulse. The priest rushed forward to restrain him, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air, impossible and undeniable. Vorsalis lowered her bolt pistol, just slightly. Not out of mercy, not out of doubt, but out of something that an inquisitor of 40 years had learned to recognize: uncertainty. If the creature was not of the warp, then execution protocols changed. If it was not demonic, then purging might not be sufficient. If it was truly other, truly foreign to this reality, then it required study, analysis, containment. She looked at the stranger, who had not moved, who still wore that expression of infinite sadness, and she realized that she had made a mistake. Not in coming here, not in drawing her weapon, but in assuming she understood what she was dealing with. "Restrain him," she ordered, her voice harder now, colder. "Full containment protocols. No one touches him. No one speaks to him. We're taking him to Terra." The stormtroopers moved forward with their restraints, heavy manacles designed to hold even an Astartes, blessed oils still wet on the metal. But before they could reach the stranger, before the first chain could be wrapped around his wrists, the sky above Tertius Harvester 9 began to burn. Not with fire, with something worse. The warp tore open like a wound in the fabric of reality, a great gash of crimson and black that spread across the pale sky like blood in water. The air itself screamed. Reality shuddered, and through that tear, descending on pillars of brass and fury, came the warband. They were Khorne berserkers, world-eaters, the butchers of 1,000 worlds. Once they had been space marines, the finest warriors humanity had ever created. Sons of Angron the Red Angel. Now they were something else, something less, and something more. The butcher's nails sang in their skulls, ancient technology that turned pain into pleasure and rage into divinity. They lived only to kill. They knew only slaughter. 12 of them landed in the fields, their ancient power armor the color of dried blood, covered in skulls and chains and the names of their victims. Their chain axes roared to life, blessed by the blood god himself, each one hungry for flesh and bone. Their champion, a towering figure whose armor was so covered in trophies that the original ceramite was barely visible, raised his weapon and howled a challenge that was not words but pure, distilled violence. The workers screamed and fled. Malthan collapsed, his mind breaking under the psychic pressure of the warp breach. The stormtroopers opened fire immediately, hellgun beams lancing through the air, but the shots splashed harmlessly against the berserker's armor. The priest began to chant prayers of protection, but his voice was drowned out by the roaring of chain axes. Inquisitor Vorsalis knew, with the cold certainty of experience, that everyone on this world was about to die. A dozen world-eaters could carve through an entire regiment. These workers, these stormtroopers, even herself, they were all dead. The only question was how long it would take. The berserkers charged, their movements impossibly fast for beings in such heavy armor, driven by the rage that consumed every thought, every instinct. They spread out in a killing formation, chain axes already swinging, already tasting the blood that was about to flow. And the stranger stepped forward. He moved between the berserkers and the fleeing civilians, placing himself in the path of their charge. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his fists. He did not call upon the Emperor or any power that Vorsalis could recognize. He simply stood there, one hand raised, palm outward, as if that gesture alone could stop what was coming. The lead berserker swung his chain axe in an arc that would have cleaved the stranger in half. The weapon, blessed by Khorne himself, empowered by 8,000 years of slaughter, descended toward flesh that should have offered no resistance, and stopped. Not with a clash, not with a spark. The chain axe simply ceased moving, as if it had struck something immovable, something that existed beyond the concept of resistance. The berserker roared in confusion and pulled back, tried to swing again, but his arms would not obey. The chain axe fell from his grip, landing in the dirt with a sound that seemed too quiet for such a violent thing. The other berserkers surged forward, and one by one, they stopped. Their weapons fell silent. Their movements ceased. They stood frozen, not by paralysis, not by some psychic power that held their limbs, but by something else, something that Vorsalis could not name. And then, one by one, they began to scream. Not the battle cries of Khorne's champions, not the rage-filled howls of warriors drunk on violence. These were screams of anguish, of recognition, of souls suddenly remembering what they had lost. The butcher's nails, those ancient instruments of torture that had been hammered into their brains, went silent for the first time in centuries. In the sudden absence of that screaming pain, in the quiet that rushed in to fill the space where rage had been, the berserkers remembered. They remembered their names, their real names, not the titles of murder they had taken. They remembered their brothers, before the betrayal, before the nails, before Istvan. They remembered what it had been like to serve something other than slaughter. They remembered duty, honor, nobility, everything the World Eaters had been before they had become monsters. The champion fell to his knees, his chain axe lying forgotten in the grain. He tore off his helmet with shaking hands, revealing a face that was more scar tissue than flesh, eyes that wept blood from the damage the nails had done. He looked at the stranger, and his voice, when it came, was broken and small. "What have I done?" he whispered. "Emperor, forgive me. What have I done?" The other berserkers collapsed around him, their massive frames shaking with sobs that sounded like earthquakes. They wept for the men they had been. They wept for the brothers they had killed. They wept for 8,000 years of atrocity that they could suddenly see with perfect clarity. In the warp, the Chaos Gods felt it. Khorne rose from his throne of skulls, his rage transcending anything that could be called emotion. This was not defeat in battle. This was not even death. This was erasure. His champions had been taken from him, not through force but through restoration, as if the corruption he had layered into their souls had simply been wiped away. He roared, and the sound echoed across the immaterium, causing demons to flee and mortal psychers across the galaxy to clutch their heads in agony. Tzeentch watched with 1,000 eyes, his curiosity curdling into something that resembled fear. This stranger did not change fate. He erased it. He made possibilities that should exist simply cease to be. Nurgle felt the absence like a missing tooth. Where disease should flourish in the stranger's presence, there was only health. Where entropy should reign, there was only order. It was an insult to the very concept of decay. Slaanesh tasted the stranger's essence and recoiled. There was no excess here, no desire, no sensation pushed beyond its limits, only purity, and purity was poison to the Prince of Pleasure. The four moved as one, their attention focused on that single point in real space, and for the first time since they had ascended to godhood, they felt something that gods should never feel: uncertainty. On Terra, in the deepest heart of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor stirred upon the golden throne. The custodians felt his attention shift, felt the immense weight of his psychic presence turn away from the Astronomicon, just for a moment, towards something else. He knew. He had known from the moment the light had entered his galaxy. He had felt it pierce through the warp, had sensed its impossible nature, had recognized what it represented. And now, feeling the Chaos God's uncertainty, feeling their fear, he made a choice. He remained silent. The custodians waited for orders that did not come. The tech priests monitored the Golden Throne for any sign of the Emperor's will. The Adeptus Terra prepared for guidance that remained unspoken. And in that silence, the galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when an impossibility continued to exist in a universe that had long ago stopped believing in miracles. The silence lingered for 3 heartbeats, and in those 3 heartbeats, the fate of the galaxy trembled on a razor's edge. Then the custodians came. They arrived on Tertius Harvester 9, not in gunships, but in a vessel that bore no markings, no heraldry, nothing that would identify it as belonging to the most elite warriors humanity had ever created. They came with the authority of the throne itself, and when they spoke, even Inquisitor Vorsalis knelt. "The Emperor has called for this one," the custodian captain said. His voice filtered through a helm of burnished auramite. "He will come to Terra. He will stand before the Golden Throne. This is not a request." The stranger went willingly. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply walked between the custodians, his presence so incongruous among these golden giants that it seemed like a scene from a dream. The weeping berserkers were left behind, still on their knees, still drowning in the sudden weight of their sins. The workers watched in silence as the stranger was taken away. Some wept, others simply stared, as if trying to memorize his face before he vanished from their lives forever. The journey to Terra took 17 days through the warp, but the ship did not suffer the usual torments that plagued vessels traveling through the immaterium. The Geller fields held strong, but more than that, the warp itself seemed to quiet in the stranger's presence. The navigators reported that the currents ran smooth, almost gentle, as if even the immaterium did not know how to react to what moved through it. Terra appeared in the viewport like a jewel wrapped in clouds of pollution and orbital defense platforms. The throne world, the heart of the Imperium, a planet that had once been green and beautiful, now covered in hive cities and industrial sprawl. Its oceans long since boiled away, its forests replaced by monuments to human ambition and human decay. The stranger looked at it through the ship's viewing port, and the custodian standing guard beside him thought he saw something like sorrow cross that eternal face. They descended through layers of orbital defenses that could annihilate fleet groups, past weapon platforms that had stood vigil for 10,000 years, through clouds of industrial smog that never cleared. The Imperial Palace rose from the surface like a mountain range made of gold and marble, a structure so vast that entire cities existed within its walls, so ancient that parts of it predated recorded history. The Eternity Gate stood before them, massive beyond comprehension, inscribed with the names of heroes and the deeds of saints, guarded by custodians who had not moved from their posts in centuries. The gate opened slowly, its mechanisms groaning with the weight of millennia, and the stranger walked through. He walked through halls where Primarchs had once strode. He passed beneath archways that had witnessed the birth of the Imperium. He moved through corridors where the very air seemed heavy with the weight of history, where every stone had been placed with purpose, where every inscription told a story of triumph or tragedy. The custodians flanked him, their guardian spears held at rest but ready to strike in an instant if he showed any sign of threat. He showed none. He simply walked, his pace steady, his expression calm, as if he were taking a morning stroll rather than approaching the most sacred place in the entire Imperium. The throne room opened before them, vast and terrible and beautiful. The ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into shadow. Pillars the size of hive spires held up the vaulted roof, and at the far end, seated upon a throne of gold and surrounded by machinery that hummed with barely contained power, was the Emperor. He was not what the propaganda depicted. There was no radiant figure of divine perfection, no golden warrior in shining armor. There was only a corpse, ancient beyond measure, held together by technology and psychic will, kept alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers every single day. His flesh had long since withered, his bones visible beneath skin that looked like parchment. Tubes and cables connected him to machinery that stretched into the depths of the palace, feeding him the souls he needed to maintain the Astronomicon, to keep the lighthouse burning so that humanity could navigate the warp. And yet, despite the decay, despite the horror of what he had become, power radiated from him. Not the corrupt power of chaos, but something older, something that predated the gods themselves. Psychic force so immense that it made the air itself vibrate, that made reality bend around his presence. The stranger walked forward until he stood at the base of the golden throne. The custodians remained behind, forming a golden ring around the chamber. They did not speak, they did not move. They simply watched, as they had watched for 10,000 years. And then, the Emperor spoke, not with words, not through the air. He spoke directly into the stranger's mind, but not through the warp. This was something else, something that bypassed psychic channels entirely, as if he were speaking through the fundamental fabric of existence itself. What are you? The question was not accusatory. It was not afraid. It was simply curious, the kind of question that one ancient being might ask another. The stranger answered in the same way, his thoughts clear and unguarded. I am what you once dreamed of, a guardian, a protector, but I am not from your reality. The Emperor's psychic presence flared, not with anger but with recognition, with sorrow. The custodians felt it wash over them, a wave of emotion so profound that several of them took involuntary steps backward. Their lord, who had not shown such feeling in millennia, who had become little more than a lighthouse burning souls for fuel, was experiencing something that resembled loss. I know what you are, the Emperor said, and his mental voice carried the weight of ages. I tried to create you. 20 times I tried. 20 sons, each one designed to be what you are. Guardians, protectors, ideals made flesh, and every one of them failed. Some fell to chaos. Some died. Some simply became human, with all the weaknesses that entails. I thought it impossible. I thought I had reached for something that could not exist. And yet here I stand, the stranger said quietly. Here you stand, the Emperor agreed, in the wrong universe, in a reality that has no place for what you represent. The silence stretched between them, two beings who existed beyond normal comprehension, studying each other across the space of the throne room. You do not belong here, the Emperor said finally. This universe will break you, or you will break it. There is no middle ground. Hope is a poison here. Compassion is a weakness. You cannot save this galaxy. I could not save it, and I am older than most of the stars you can see. The stranger was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his mental voice was steady. Then I will try to mend it. The Emperor laughed. It was not a sound that came through the air. It was psychic, vast, echoing through the minds of every custodian in the chamber. A laugh that held no humor, only bitterness and recognition and a terrible, aching sadness. I said the same thing once, the Emperor said. 30,000 years ago, I looked at humanity and I thought, I can fix this. I can make them better. I can guide them to greatness. And look what I created. An imperium built on faith in a god I never claimed to be. A crusade that devoured worlds. Sons who betrayed me. A throne that is both my salvation and my tomb. The laugh faded, replaced by something heavier. "You will fail," the Emperor said. "Not because you are weak, but because this galaxy does not want to be saved." The stranger stood in the silence that followed those words, and for a long moment, he did not respond. The custodians watched, their hands tightening imperceptibly on their guardian spears. The machinery of the Golden Throne hummed and clicked, feeding souls into the Emperor's dying form, keeping the Astronomicon burning. Finally, the stranger spoke. "Perhaps, but I cannot stand by and watch suffering when I have the power to end it." "Then you will suffer for it," the Emperor said, and there was something almost gentle in his mental voice. "Go, do what you must. But know that I have seen this story before. I have lived it, and I know how it ends." The stranger bowed, a gesture of respect between equals, and turned to leave. As he walked back through the Eternity Gate, back into a galaxy that did not want him, the Emperor's presence withdrew, returning to its eternal vigil, to the endless task of keeping humanity's lighthouse burning. But as the stranger departed, one final thought reached him, quiet as a whisper, heavy as a world. "I wish I could have made you." The stranger left Terra and began to move through the Imperium, world by world, system by system, bringing with him something that the galaxy had not seen in 10,000 years. Not miracles, not divine intervention, simply help. On a forge world in the Segmentum Solar, he walked among the Skitarii and the tech priests, and where he passed, the radiation burns healed. The mutations caused by centuries of exposure to toxic machinery faded. Workers who had been blinded by arc welders could suddenly see. The Mechanicus studied him with growing alarm, running every scan, every test, every analysis protocol they possessed. He registered as human, but also not human. He had no bionics, no augmentations, yet he functioned beyond the parameters that flesh should allow. He was an anomaly, and the Mechanicus did not tolerate anomalies. On a hive world in Ultramar, he descended into the underhive where gangers ruled and the Arbites rarely ventured. He found children starving in the darkness, their bodies twisted by malnutrition and disease. He fed them. He healed them. He taught them that there was another way to live. Within weeks, the violence in the underhive had dropped by 70%. Within a month, the Hab blocks were organizing themselves, creating systems of mutual aid, turning away from the cruelty that had defined their existence. The planetary governor, seeing his control beginning to slip, called for the Inquisition. On a war-torn world in the Segmentum Tempestus, where Imperial Guard regiments were locked in a grinding conflict with heretic forces, he walked into no man's land between the trenches. Both sides opened fire. Las bolts and stubber rounds filled the air around him. He did not return fire. He simply raised his hands and the shooting stopped. Not because the soldiers chose to stop, but because they found themselves unable to pull the triggers. For a moment in the sudden silence, they saw each other not as enemies, but as human beings, broken and afraid, and so very tired of war. Some laid down their weapons. Others wept. The commissars executed the ones who refused to fight, and the war continued. But the stranger had planted a seed of doubt that would not be easily uprooted. The ecclesiarchy declared him a false prophet. Preachers stood in cathedrals across the Imperium and denounced him as a Xenos trick, a demon's illusion, a test of faith that the righteous must resist. To follow him was to turn away from the Emperor. To accept his help was to doubt the Emperor's plan. And doubt was heresy. Doubt was corruption. Doubt was death. The Inquisition branded him anathema. His image was distributed to every ordo, Every conclave, every cell of throne agents across the galaxy. Kill on sight. No interrogation. No study. Simply eradication. The order came from the highest levels of the Inquisitorial Command. This being represented a threat to the stability of the Imperium itself. Not because he was dangerous, but because he offered an alternative to the suffering that kept the Imperium functioning. Hope was a poison. Mercy was a weakness. These were the truths upon which the Imperium had been built, the foundations that had allowed humanity to survive 10,000 years of unending war. To allow hope was to allow questions. To allow mercy was to allow the possibility that the Imperium's cruelty was not necessary. And if the cruelty was not necessary, then what did that say about the trillions who had died to maintain it? The Imperium could not allow such questions, and so it turned its guns on the one being who only wanted to help. On a civilized world in the Segmentum Pacificus, 3 guard regiments were deployed with a single order: find the stranger and eliminate him. They found him in a refugee camp, tending to civilians who had been displaced by an orc invasion. He stood among the sick and the wounded, his hands glowing with that gentle golden light, healing injuries that Imperial Medici would have declared untreatable. The guard opened fire, not at him. They had been ordered to avoid direct engagement if possible. Instead, they fired into the camp itself, las bolts cutting through tents and flesh, artillery shells turning the ground into a crater-pocked wasteland. If they could not kill him, they would kill everyone around him, force him to choose between fleeing and dying. He did not flee. He did not die. He simply stood between the civilians and the incoming fire, and every shot that should have killed them stopped. Las bolts dissipated against an invisible barrier. Artillery shells detonated harmlessly in the air. The civilians cowered behind him, screaming, praying, begging for the Emperor's protection. The guard advanced, firing continuously, pouring enough ordnance into the camp to level a hive block. And still the stranger stood, his face set in an expression of profound sorrow, protecting people who would never thank him, who would likely curse him once this was over, who had been taught their entire lives that suffering was holy, and help from anyone other than the Emperor was corruption. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it finally ended, when the guards' ammunition was exhausted and their officers called for a tactical withdrawal, the camp still stood. The civilians still lived, but the fields around the camp were covered in bodies. Guardsmen who had died firing at an enemy who would not fight back. Soldiers who had followed orders and paid for it with their lives. The stranger walked among the corpses, and for the first time since he had entered this universe, he wept, not from pain, not from fear, but from the terrible, crushing realization that he could not save these people from themselves, that the Imperium would rather see millions die than accept help from someone who served no god, who answered to no authority, who simply wanted to ease suffering. He stood alone on that battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of men who had died trying to kill him, and understood what the Emperor had tried to tell him. This galaxy did not want salvation. It had been broken for so long that it had forgotten what wholeness looked like. It had learned to worship its chains, to find meaning in its suffering, to build monuments to its own decay. And he, with all his power, with all his compassion, could not change that, because they did not want to change. The tears dried on his face, but the weight of them remained, settling into his chest like iron. He stood among the dead for a long time, so long that the sun set and rose again, casting shadows that stretched and shortened across the battlefield. The civilians he had saved fled during the night, terrified that his presence would bring more death. They were right to flee. He understood that now. But the Chaos Gods had been watching, and they saw opportunity in his despair. The first voice came like a whisper in a library, intelligent and layered with infinite possibility. Tzeentch spoke not with words but with visions, showing the stranger 1,000 futures branching from this moment. In one, he reshaped reality itself, rewriting the laws that governed this broken universe, forcing peace through sheer alteration of existence. In another, he unmade the warp, sealed the Eye of Terror, erased the Chaos Gods from history. The architect of fate showed him paths to victory, each one achievable, each one requiring only that the stranger accept knowledge, accept power, accept the gift of change. You cannot save them as you are, the voice whispered, fractal and beautiful. But become more. Become what this universe needs. I can show you how to remake everything. No more suffering. No more war. Only the perfection of infinite possibility. The stranger felt the offer like a weight pressing against his mind. It would be so easy. To simply accept. To take the power and force this galaxy into something better. But he had seen what happened when beings tried to force salvation on those who did not want it. He had seen it in the Emperor's broken dream, in the Imperium's endless cruelty, justified as necessary evil. No, he said quietly, and the word echoed through the immaterium like a stone dropped into still water. The second voice came like the settling of dust, patient and eternal. Nurgle spoke with the warmth of acceptance, showing the stranger a different kind of peace. Not through healing, but through the cessation of all striving. Death was not the enemy. Suffering was not the problem. The problem was resistance, the futile struggle against the natural order of decay. If the stranger would only embrace entropy, if he would accept that all things must end, then he could bring true peace. The peace of the grave, the comfort of dissolution, an end to pain through the simple act of stopping. You cannot heal what does not wish to be healed, the voice murmured, thick and gentle. But you can grant release. Let them rest. Let them sleep. Let them become part of the great cycle, where nothing suffers because nothing strives. The stranger felt the seduction of it, the terrible logic. How much easier it would be to simply let go, to allow this galaxy to slide into its inevitable ending without fighting every step of the way. But that was surrender. That was giving up on the possibility that things could be better, even if those who suffered could not yet see it. No, he said again, and his voice was firmer now. The third voice came like thunder, like the clash of blades, like the roar of a warrior who had never known defeat. Khorne spoke with brutal honesty, showing the stranger the simplest solution of all. These people suffered because they were weak. The Imperium was cruel because it was ruled by cowards who hid behind faith and doctrine. But the stranger was strong, stronger than any being in this galaxy. He could break their chains through force, could shatter the Imperium and build something better on its ruins. All he needed was to accept strength, to stop holding back, to become the conqueror this galaxy needed. You have power beyond measure, the voice growled, savage and direct. Use it. Take what they will not give freely. Rule them. Protect them whether they consent or not. Strength is the only truth. Everything else is weakness pretending to be virtue. The stranger felt rage rising in him for the first time since entering this universe. Anger at the waste, at the unnecessary suffering, at the stubborn refusal of this galaxy to accept help. It would be so satisfying to simply take control, to impose order through sheer unstoppable force. But that would make him no different from the Emperor, no different from the tyrants he had sworn to protect people from. No, he said, and the rage died before it could take root. The fourth voice came like silk against skin, like pleasure and pain intermingled until they became indistinguishable. Slaanesh spoke with exquisite precision, showing the stranger the only escape that remained. This universe was broken beyond repair. These people were doomed, but he did not have to share their fate. He could transcend, could step beyond this reality entirely, could achieve a perfection that would allow him to exist untouched by the suffering around him. Not abandonment, evolution, becoming something that existed above and beyond the concerns of lesser beings. "You do not belong here," the voice purred, beautiful and terrible. "You never did. Stop trying to save what cannot be saved. Transcend. Become. Perfect yourself until their suffering can no longer touch you. It is the only mercy left." The stranger felt the temptation like a knife, sharp and precise. To simply leave, to accept that he had tried and failed, and that was enough. To stop carrying the weight of a galaxy that did not want to be carried. "No," he said, and his voice carried finality. "I will not abandon them. I will not corrupt them. I will not force them. And I will not transcend at their expense." The four voices withdrew, but not in defeat, in fury. The warp convulsed. Reality tore in a dozen places across the sector where the stranger had been operating. A black crusade poured through the Cadian Gate, led by a champion of Khorne who had waited centuries for this moment. A plague fleet materialized in the void, ancient ships covered in rust and pestilence, carrying the gifts of Nurgle to every world they touched. Demonic incursions erupted on civilized worlds, things of impossible geometry and maddening beauty spilling through the cracks in reality. Slaaneshi cults rose from hiding, their centuries of preparation culminating in orgies of violence that left entire hive blocks drowning in excess. They converged on the sector like a tide of madness, and at the center of it all was the stranger. The Chaos Gods had made their intentions clear. If he would not serve them, they would drown everything he tried to protect in such overwhelming horror that he would have no choice but to act. And the stranger, for the first time since entering this universe, had to make a choice he had never wanted to make. He had to kill. Demons descended upon refugee camps, and he stood between them and the innocent. And when they would not stop, when they could not be reasoned with or turned away, he destroyed them. His hands, which had only ever healed, now unmade. Plague bearers dissolved into ash. Bloodletters shattered like glass. Daemonettes screamed as their forms were erased from existence. He hated every moment of it. Each death, even the death of entities that were pure corruption, weighed on him like stones. He was not a destroyer. He had never been meant to be. But here, in this broken universe, there was no other choice. The battles raged for weeks. Entire worlds burned. The stranger moved from crisis to crisis, saving what he could, destroying what he must, and all the while feeling the warp respond to his anguish. His hope had been a beacon. Now his despair was a feast. The Chaos Gods fed on his suffering, grew stronger from his reluctant violence, laughed as they forced him to become something he had never wanted to be. And he realized, standing on a world where millions had just died despite his best efforts, the terrible truth that the Emperor had tried to warn him about. His very presence was making things worse. The realization settled over him like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Every world he had touched, every person he had healed, every moment of hope he had offered had become a target. The Chaos Gods used his compassion as a weapon, knowing that he would come to defend those he had helped, knowing that each defense would require more violence, more destruction, more of the very thing he had never wanted to be. He was a beacon in the darkness, and he was drawing every predator in the galaxy toward the innocent. The stranger made his way to the one place where the boundary between reality and unreality was thinnest. Not the Eye of Terror, where chaos reigned supreme, but the Cadian Gate, where the Imperium had held the line for 10,000 years. where reality and madness pressed against each other with such force that the barrier between them had worn thin as parchment. He stood at the threshold of the warp itself, feeling the immaterium press against his mind, feeling the weight of infinite suffering echoing through that realm of pure thought and emotion. The Chaos Gods waited there, patient now, knowing that they had won simply by forcing him to this moment. And then, one final time, the Emperor spoke. Not with the power he had possessed in the throne room, not with the strength of a being who could hold the Astronomicon steady for 10 millennia. This was barely a whisper, a thread of consciousness stretched so thin it was almost invisible, but it reached across the galaxy to touch the stranger's mind one last time. "You cannot save this galaxy," the Emperor said, and his mental voice was weary beyond measure. "But you can choose how you leave it." The stranger closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that truth. "I know," he said quietly. "Stay," the Emperor continued, "and you will become what they need. Not what you are, not what you want to be, but what this universe requires. A god, a tyrant, another emperor to replace the dying one. You will rule through fear and faith, because that is all they understand. You will become me, and in 10,000 years, someone else will look at you and wonder how something that began with such pure intention became such absolute corruption." The stranger felt the path stretching before him, clear as crystal. He could stay. He could take control of the Imperium, could force them to accept his help, could impose order through sheer unstoppable will. He would save them despite themselves, and in doing so, he would become exactly what he had come to oppose. "Or leave," the Emperor whispered. "Step back through the veil between realities. Return to wherever you came from, if such a place still exists for you. Leave this galaxy to its slow collapse into oblivion. Let us fail on our own terms, without the complication of your presence." "And the people I helped?" the stranger asked. "The ones who remembered what it felt like to hope." "They will be crushed," the Emperor said, with the honesty that came from having lived through every possible consequence of every possible choice. "The Imperium does not forgive deviation. They will be purged, re-educated, or forgotten. Your kindness will become another footnote in the endless catalogue of heresies that we have burned away." The stranger opened his eyes and looked back at the Imperium. Across 1,000,000 worlds he saw the suffering, the hive cities where billions lived in darkness, the forge worlds where workers were ground down into spare parts for machines they would never understand, the shrine worlds where faith had curdled into fanaticism, the war zones where young men and women died by the millions for objectives they could not name, fighting enemies they did not understand, all in service to an emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years. He saw the vision the emperor had tried to build: unity, strength, a human galaxy where mankind stood supreme, enlightened by reason and guided by wisdom. And he saw how that vision had curdled into something monstrous, how the tools meant to protect humanity had become its chains, how the faith meant to inspire had become a prison. He understood now. The Emperor had not failed because he was weak. He had failed because success was impossible, because this galaxy, this universe of endless war and suffering, did not want salvation. It wanted meaning, and it had found meaning in its own destruction. Hope here was not kindness. It was cruelty. To offer salvation was to prolong agony, to give people a glimpse of something better only to watch it be torn away by the very forces that claimed to protect them. "I understand," the stranger said, and his voice was quiet but certain. "I cannot save them. I can only let them go." He made his choice. He did not stay. He did not conquer. He did not become a god or a tyrant or another emperor for this broken imperium to worship and resent in equal measure. He turned away from the galaxy, from the suffering, from the endless war, and began to step back through the veil between realities. But before he left, he did one final thing. He reached across the galaxy, across the impossible distance between the Cadian Gate and Holy Terror, and he touched the Golden Throne. Not physically, not through the warp, but through that same channel the Emperor had used to speak to him. That connection that existed beyond the limitations of space and psychic energy. He did not try to heal the Emperor. The Emperor was beyond healing, sustained only by will and sacrifice, and the terrible necessity of keeping the Astronomicon burning. To heal him would be to kill him, to remove the only thing keeping humanity from drowning in the darkness of the warp. Instead, the stranger gave him something else, something the Emperor had not felt in 10,000 years. Peace, not the peace of ending, not death or release, or the cessation of consciousness, but a moment, a single perfect moment where the pain stopped, where the weight lifted, where the Emperor could simply exist without the crushing burden of responsibility, without the screaming of the Astronomicon, without the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers burning themselves out to keep him alive. For one heartbeat, the Emperor felt no pain. For one heartbeat, he remembered what it had been like before the throne, before the betrayal, before the heresy, when he had been simply a man with a vision, walking among other men, trying to build something better. For one heartbeat, he felt joy. And then the stranger was gone. He faded from the galaxy like morning mist, stepping back through the veil between realities, returning to whatever dimension had birthed him. The light that had pierced the warp, that had burned through the immaterium like a wound in madness itself, simply ceased to be. The Chaos Gods raged. They had been denied their prize, their toy, their new plaything. But their rage faded quickly, replaced by the eternal games they had played before the stranger arrived and would continue to play long after he was forgotten. The Imperium noticed the absence the way one might notice a missing tooth. Something had been there, something that had disturbed the natural order, and now it was gone. The Inquisition would investigate. The Ecclesiarchy would declare it a test of faith passed. The Mechanicus would file reports, and slowly, carefully, systematically, every record of the stranger would be erased. But on Terra, in the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sat upon his golden throne and remembered that single moment of peace. And though he could not smile, though his face was locked in the rictus of eternal suffering, something in his vast psychic presence changed. Not hope. The Emperor was beyond hope, but gratitude. For a gift he had never expected to receive, for the memory of what it felt like to be at peace. The gratitude lingered in the warp for a moment, a ripple that touched the minds of sanctioned psychers across the Imperium, before fading back into the eternal cacophony of the Immaterium. The custodians in the throne room felt it, that momentary lightness in their Lord's presence, and they would speak of it in whispers for years to come, though they would never fully understand what it meant. The galaxy continued its slow spiral into oblivion, unchanged by the stranger's passage. The wars ground on, the faithful prayed, the heretics corrupted, the Xenos invaded. Nothing had fundamentally shifted. The great engine of suffering that was the 41st millennium continued to turn, indifferent to the brief interruption of its rhythm. The Inquisition moved with systematic precision. Every world the stranger had touched was investigated, catalogued, and cleansed. The workers on Tertius Harveston 9 were questioned, their memories probed by sanctioned psychers, their faith tested through pain and deprivation. Those who spoke too fondly of the stranger were re-educated. Those who refused to recant were executed. The fields where he had first appeared were burned, the soil blessed with holy oils, the air purified with sacred incense. Overseer Malthon was found guilty of failing to report Xenos activity with appropriate urgency. He was executed 3 months after the stranger's departure, his body burned and his ashes scattered into the void. No one mourned him. On an agri-world, overseers were as replaceable as the grain they harvested. The ecclesiarchy issued declarations from 1,000 pulpits. The miracles had been false, illusions of the warp designed to test the faithful. The stranger had been a demon, or perhaps a Xenos psyker, using cheap tricks to seduce the weak-minded away from the Emperor's light. To speak of him was heresy. To remember him fondly was corruption. Faith required certainty, and certainty required that this anomaly be erased from history. The Mechanicus filed their reports in data vaults deep within Mars, encrypted and sealed behind protocols that would not be accessed for centuries. The stranger had registered as human but functioned beyond human parameters. He had violated the laws of physics as the Mechanicus understood them. He was an impossibility that had briefly existed and then ceased. The logical conclusion was that the data was corrupted, the measurements flawed, the observations unreliable. The reports were marked as null and archived accordingly. Even the berserkers who had wept at the stranger's touch were hunted down. A kill team of Grey Knights tracked them through the warp, finding them on a dead world where they had gone to hide from what they had remembered. The Grey Knights expected a fight. What they found were 12 former World Eaters kneeling in prayer, their weapons discarded, their armor stripped away, begging for execution. The Grey Knights granted their request, because mercy for chaos touched was heresy, even when the chaos had been burned away. The Chaos Gods returned to their eternal games. Khorne gathered skulls. Nurgle spread plagues. Tzeentch wove plots. Slaanesh pursued excess. The stranger became a curiosity, a strange moment in their timeless existence, soon forgotten in favor of newer amusements. They were gods, and gods did not dwell on defeats that left no lasting damage. The galaxy did not remember him. Within a year, it was as if he had never existed. The light that had pierced the warp, that had burned with impossible purity through the madness of the immaterium, left no trace. History, written by the victors and the survivors, had no place for anomalies that could not be explained or weaponized. But on Tertius Harvester 9, in a worker barracks on the edge of the northern fields, a child remembered. She had been 7 years old when the stranger had touched her forehead and healed the lesions that had covered her body since birth. She had been the first to approach him, the first to laugh, the first to feel what it was like to live without pain. Her name was Mira, though on an agri-world, names were luxuries reserved for those who lived long enough to matter. Mira grew. She survived the Inquisition's purge by being too young to be considered a serious heretic, too unimportant to waste resources executing. She worked the fields as her parents had, as their parents had, as generations before them had. She bent her back to the grain and bled her hands on the stalks, and lived the life that the Imperium had designed for her. But she did not forget. When she was old enough, when she had earned the right to speak without immediate punishment, she began to tell stories. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet moments between shifts, when the overseers were not watching, when the workers gathered in the darkness of the barracks and tried to remember what it felt like to be human. She told them about a golden man who had come from the stars, who had healed the sick not because they deserved it, but simply because he could, who had asked for nothing in return, who had looked at the workers of Tertius Harvester 9, the lowest and most forgotten of the Emperor's subjects, and seen them as worth saving. The stories spread. Not quickly, not obviously, but like seeds carried on the wind, they took root in unexpected places. A worker on Tertius Harvester 9 told her daughter, who told a cousin who had been conscripted into the Imperial Guard, who told a fellow soldier before dying on some nameless battlefield, who told a medici, who told a scribe, who wrote it down in a private journal that would survive 3 centuries before being found by a priest who would be declared heretic for reading it. The story changed as it spread. Details were added, removed, distorted. In some versions, the stranger was an angel of the Emperor, sent to test the faithful. In others, he was a lost Primarch, returned to save humanity from itself. In still others, he was simply a man who had remembered what compassion looked like and tried to practice it before being destroyed by the very people he tried to help. But the core remained, a golden man who came from the stars and wept for humanity, who healed without asking for faith, who protected without demanding obedience, who left without asking for gratitude. It became myth. It became heresy. It became a whispered story that mothers told their children in the darkness, a fairy tale for a galaxy that had forgotten what hope looked like. The Inquisition burned those who told the story too loudly. The ecclesiarchy declared it corruption. But they could not burn every whisper, could not execute every memory. The story endured, stubborn and quiet, a tiny ember in the darkness. And somewhere, in the space between realities, in a dimension that the Imperium could not reach and the Chaos Gods could not touch, the stranger watched. He had failed. He knew that. He had not saved the galaxy. He had not ended the suffering. He had not even made a lasting difference. His presence had been erased as thoroughly as if he had never existed. But on one small world, a woman named Mira told stories to her children, and her children would tell those stories to theirs. And perhaps, in some small way, he had reminded them of what they had lost. Not enough to change them, not enough to save them, but enough that they remembered for just a moment what it had felt like to be valued simply for existing. It was not salvation, but it was something. And in a galaxy where hope was poison and mercy was weakness, even something was more than most beings would ever achieve. On a dying craft world drifting through the void, the Farseer's body lay in state, prepared for the final journey into the infinity circuit. Her soul, released from flesh, drifted through the crystalline pathways of Wraithbone, joining the chorus of the dead. She felt them all around her, 10 million voices singing in harmony and discord, the accumulated wisdom and madness of her people. And as she settled into her new existence, as her consciousness merged with the greater whole, she remembered that moment. The light, the impossible light that had burned through the warp and changed nothing and everything. She whispered the same words she had spoken in her final living moments. But this time, the terror was gone. This time there was only understanding. Impossible. And the void, vast and indifferent, answered with silence.